Waco.
Kyle Youmans, part of the Dallas Cowboys game day broadcast and more, DallasCowboys.com. We saw him when we were at the Big 12 Pro Day back a few weeks ago. Kyle Youmans joins us on 365 Sports. We get to look at him, too, via Zoom. And thanks for your time, Kyle. What are the Cowboys have drafted well. Will McClay, they've done a nice job in the personnel department. Do you have confidence that they will have a weekend where they come out of it with enough to help them, or is that going to take still some free agent signings?
Hang on, Kyle. Turn your volume on.
Okay. Nope, not there. We see you, we just can't hear you. Oh, we'll check that in just a second.
Yeah.
Paul, we'll get back to Kyle.
Okay.
I'll ask you.
I think there's a good chance they do get some guys that'll help them. I'm concerned from what I'm hearing from the front office where they're confident in the roster the way that it is right now. I don't like that. I don't like the way that they're approaching. I heard them
say that in that hour.
Yeah, like it makes me a little like I wouldn't be confident in this roster given all the stuff that's going on here. So I don't know. I may have to call Kyle. Should I just call him?
Yeah, let's just do cell phone. Okay, sorry about that. We'll get Kyle Youmans. Does a lot with the Cowboys, game day operations with them, and also, of course, a part of DallasCowboys.com. So, yeah, I listened to part of Jerry, Steven, and then also Mike McCarthy. They're not going to say they don't like their roster. They're not going to say they don't have a roster that they feel like could be a playoff team. They admitted that they are in a credit card situation where the balance is due or the interest has doubled and tripled because of who they've tried to sign to contracts, some of them that worked out and some that haven't. Yesterday, Garrett, the cost of CeeDee Lamb just went up because Detroit signed one of their best weapons. So the cost of CeeDee Lamb went up, and that was one of the things they asked Jerry, in fact, in the press conference. Well, why don't you sign those guys now? And he's like, well, you want to, like, run in the option. Do you pitch it here? It was weird the way he explained that, honestly. But that's with and now CeeDee Lamb's going to cost more money. All right, Kyle Youmans, DallasCowboys.com with us. Kyle, thanks for your time. Do you feel like the Cowboys, with who they have to pick, where they're drafting, what they have not yet done in the draft, in free agency, can they get all or most of what they absolutely need this weekend, or is it going to be a process throughout the offseason?
Yeah, I think, Smokey, it's still a process. It's a start to that process. And for the most part, this is a team that does draft and develop. We've known that. You guys have known that over covering this team for the last decade and a half is the fact that they do like building through the draft. And last year didn't work in their favor. And I think that does put more pressure on the 2024 draft class because of the ineffectiveness of the 2023 draft class. So you're going to see them make some picks that address needs. You're going to see the offensive line. You're going to see linebacker. You're going to see running back throughout the draft and maybe even multiple times for those different positions. But for the most part, I still think they're going to keep things open from a best player available standpoint and take where the guys are valued best. Now, luckily for them, there's a lot of value in offensive line early. So I still think it's really almost a foregone conclusion that it will be an offensive lineman if they stay put and pick at pick number 24. But even if they trade out of that spot and they pick up some extra either late day 2, early day 3 picks, I still think offensive line is going to be a heavy piece in the early going. It's just where does the value lie after that? But even if they do draft well, Smokey, you know how this goes. You got to fill in the spots outside of that too. And you've got to still make some free agent signings and maybe go out and look at some other off-season acquisitions. But it starts with the draft, and that's the first domino that needs to fall tonight.
Kyle, their salary cap situation has put them in an enviable spot when it comes to the draft in that they have to, because they need guys to start next year, and particularly on offense. Like defense, you could cobble together 11 guys right now to start, and you've got that. On offense, you don't really have that because you don't have a center, a left tackle, or a left guard, depending on what they decide on Tyler Smith, or a running back at this time who is necessarily an NFL level every down starter. So if they put themselves in a position where they have to come out of this draft with certain positions as opposed to being able to draft best available?
Yeah, I think they have. I think that's just kind of where you're at this day and age with this roster. And it starts at our offensive line, either getting a tackle or an interior offensive lineman helps you out tremendously with the departures of Tyler Biadasz and the departure of Tyron Smith. I think adding an offensive lineman is imperative. From there, then you look at running back. Are you going into the season with your starting running backs as Royce Freeman and Malik Davis? Probably not. That's not the plan here with the Dallas Cowboys. I think there's a way that they can maybe address that in a second round, third round. A couple guys that I know you guys are familiar with, like a Jonathan Brooks out of Texas, could be in that conversation. Trey Benson from Florida State could be in that conversation. But then you've also got linebacker. And I think those are the three musts. If you're coming out of this draft class and you are addressing three needs early, it's got to be O-line, running back, and linebacker. You can maybe get away with not addressing defensive tackle again because you do have Osa Odigizua, who's shown that he can play at an exceptionally high level. You have Mozzie Smith, who you spent the first-round pick on last year. Yes, he was disappointing as a rookie, but you can't necessarily give up on him just 1 year into his NFL career. So if you're addressing needs, it's going to start with those three positions, and then everything else from that point forward is just a bonus, and you're starting to build your roster around what you have already. But you got to get some offensive line help, some linebacker help, and especially some running back help because you were thin in those spots.
Obviously, it depends on who's available, but the offensive line, do you need the center or the guard?
I think they want the tackle.
Okay.
Is really what I think they're looking at tackle because they don't want to move Tyler Smith if they don't have to. Tyler Smith is an all-pro left guard. He's a serviceable left tackle, at least in his rookie season. I mean, we haven't seen him in a year at the left tackle spot because you didn't need him. He was an all-pro left guard. So they don't necessarily want to move him if possible, but they did draft him with the intention of moving him outside and him being the left tackle of the future. So if, like you said, Smokey, if the value is there, and let's say a Graham Barton from Duke is available at pick number 24, I think he's the selection, or maybe a Troy Fontenot from Washington. If he's there, he's a guy who played left tackle but translates better as a guard. I think they would bump out a Tyler Smith if the value is there with guys like Barton and Fontenot, whereas anybody else in this draft class, it may be a question of how far and how much value can you get by trading back into the first round or even out of the first round if things fall the way that they could on draft night.
All right, so say they're blocked out of the offensive lineman that they like, at least first-round offensive lineman, and they do trade back. Wide receiver is an interesting position to me because, they've got one great wide receiver in CeeDee Lamb. They've got Brandon Cooks. But after that, it's really unsettled, and they need to give Dak Prescott as many playmakers as they can to open this offense up even more. So if a guy like, say, McConkey or Troy Franklin or Keon Coleman is there, could you see them going that route?
And are we talking right at 24?
No, after. Like if they were, say, at 28, 29.
Okay, yeah, trade out of that. I think that's a possibility. If they trade out of the 24th pick, then I think all bets are off. I really do. I'm sure they can still address offensive line by taking a guy like Tyler Guyton out of Oklahoma or Amarius Mims out of Georgia, Jordan Morgan out of Arizona. Those are the three names that I think are great trade back options for this team. But when you trade back and you pick up some extra selections and a valuable part of the draft, which is early day 3, late day 2, I think it gives you some more freedom to address some of those positions like wide receiver, because then you're talking about a later pick. You're talking about possibly a second-round graded player on your board, and then you take a guy like McConkey out of Georgia. A.D. Mitchell, I think, is an interesting thought process. You lost Michael Gallup. A.D. Mitchell's a deep threat with some burner speed as well. I really do like him a lot. He was my 6th-rated wide receiver after he ran the 4.34 at the combine. I mean, when you're 6'2" and you can run a 4.34, I'm interested. I'm in. If he's there in the early 30s, let's say you trade completely out of the first round. I don't think wide receiver is necessarily off the board, but it goes back to what I said in my previous question, or a previous answer rather. You've got to address those other three spots at some point. So you can't necessarily hinder offensive line, running back, linebacker But you do have to understand that there's a risk in taking a wide receiver that early.
Is there anyone with an injury concern that you think the Cowboys would not be in on? Because they're usually pretty liberal with that.
Ooh, that's a good question, because there's two guys that have been very popular names when it comes to the draft process, especially around the Cowboys. One is that linebacker, and it's Peyton Wilson, NC State. They brought him in as a 30 visit. I think they wanted to check the medicals. He's had double-digit surgeries during his time at NC State. And at the linebacker position, I just think it's a factor of they've been bit there before. I mean, you talk about Sean Lee, Damone Clark, Leighton Vander Esch. I don't think they would take him where his value is. He's got tremendous tape. His tape is as fun as anybody. He looks like Luke Kuechly running around tape-wise. But with a red flag injury-wise, I just don't think they take him. And then another one is Jackson Powers Johnson out of Oregon. That's a huge name in the draft process. He was very popular early on. And there's been some question marks around his health and a couple of concussions going back to Oregon that may have hindered his draft process a little bit. I think teams are looking at him in the early parts of the second round, but I think even if he falls to 56, don't expect them to take Jackson Powers Johnson. I think he's more of a third-round prospect on their board, and he would probably look over him entirely and try and address other positions.
How much, and does Will McClay get enough credit for what he's been able to do to what seems to be stabilize the personnel department and also come up with some pretty damn good players in the draft?
I think he deserves all the credit in the world. I really do. And the NFL draft is such an imperfect, perfect process, if that makes any sense. It's the fact that it's always unpredictable, but it always presents opportunity at the same time. And there are teams that are really bad at drafting, and usually those teams are not winning games. But the way that your team has won 10 or 12 games in 3 straight seasons for the first time since the mid-'90s, I think that shows that you have drafted well. Now, if you had more contribution from last year, I think you're talking about this guy as the best in the game right now. He's still in the upper echelon of drafting personnel individuals, but I don't think he deserves, or I don't think he has earned or heard enough credit for what he's done to build this roster and to put them in the situation that they're in now.
And let's talk running backs now. Jonathan Brooks obviously is the number 1 rated running back on most people's boards, but he does have the knee injury. Kyle, you know that I love Trey Benson,
Yeah.
which I think would be.
I was going to ask if you wanted to talk about him at all.
Oh yeah. No, I like, and look, for what he does and what the Cowboys need, I think he's a nice little fit for them. If they do have to draft him. After those two, it gets kind of nebulous. Do you have? I mean, talk about the first two, and then who else do you think that fits what they do as far as what Mike McCarthy likes, what kind of running backs he would bring in?
Yeah, I think you're looking at multiple smaller backs is kind of where you're at, because you go out and you get Royce Freeman, and I don't think that deters you from drafting a running back, but it does change the way that you think about adding to this room. You want a dynamic playmaker, and there's only a couple of those guys in the draft. Brooks and Benson are those two guys at the top for me. They both have second-round grades on my board. Even with the injury, I think Jonathan Brooks would be a great pick at 56. If the value is right there. If they go a little bit further down, I'm looking at a guy like Jalen Wright, 5'10", 210 pounds out of Tennessee, ran a 4.38, which was one of the faster 40 times at the combine, and his split was a 1.56, which is pretty good right off the jump. He puts his foot in the ground, and you can see that speed on tape as well. He's a dynamic playmaker, makes men miss, and he's somebody that I think would add an element to this offense that they haven't necessarily had. They thought they could maybe find lightning in a bottle with Deuce Vaughn last year, and I think it's pretty obvious Deuce Vaughn needs a little bit more seasoning. He could still get there. Darren Sproles wasn't an immediate star in the league either whenever he was drafted undersized as a running back. So there's ways that Deuce Vaughn can still get involved, but you want a guy with a little bit of size that you can rely on to be a playmaker. And another one I want to point out is Marshawn Lloyd out of USC. 5'8", 220. So he's a little bit of a wider back, still shorter, stocky sort of player. But he's quick too. And I think there's ways that you can get him involved in the passing game. He's a great pass blocker, which is something you're missing with the departure of Tony Pollard as well. So an all-around back, I actually had the Cowboys taking Marshawn Lloyd in the third round of my final mock. I really think he's a great fit. And if they address linebacker early with a guy like Edrin Cooper or Junior Colson in the second round, I think they could wait until the third and get a guy like Marshawn Lloyd out of USC. Feel pretty darn good about what they have at the running back spot.
If Jonathan Brooks, for some, is the number one running back that will be drafted, and again, there are some options. Paul mentioned Benson or whatever. How good and how high would he have been rated had he not been injured?
Ooh, I think he's in the first round, and it's really no doubt he's in the first round. He's not Bijan Robinson-esque in terms of the Texas running back tutelage that had him in the first round last year. He wasn't as high of a hype as Bijan was, but he was headed for All-American category. He was headed for one of the best running backs in the country, and of course, you guys saw what Oklahoma State did with their backfield as well. But if Brooks is healthy throughout the entire season, I think he's the one that's setting the pace, not Oklahoma State, and he's the one winning the awards along the way. So I think he could have been a first-round draft prospect, probably not where Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs would have been. They were picked, of course, both in the top 12 last year. I think Brooks would be more of like a top 20 borderline player where he would go maybe 18 to 25. And that's part of why there's some intrigue around him in the second round for the Cowboys.
All right. I would say cornerback, defensive end, and defensive tackle are three positions where anywhere throughout the draft after the first couple of picks, the Cowboys would be kind of maybe intrigued by a guy, but they could get out of there and maybe not address those positions necessarily, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. But all of which are sneaky or not even sneaky needs. You could use some cornerback help outside of your starting three with Deron Bland, Trayvon Diggs, and Jordan Lewis. What do you have at corner without Stephon Gilmore coming back yet? So there's a way that I think you can address that position, but it's not an upfront need. I think you need to leave with a defensive tackle. I really do. And there's some guys in the middle of the draft. I really like Dwayne Carter out of Duke. I had a third-round grade on him. He's probably going to fit more in the fourth. So let's say Dallas trades back and they pick up a fourth-round pick, which they don't have right now. Then maybe you look at a guy like Carter, who was a 3-year captain at Duke and just a run stuffer, provided some pass rush ability, but can be a true one technique on your defense. And even a guy like McKinley Jackson from Texas A&M could be there too. 6'1", 326. He's one of the best nose tackles in football. Played a lot of zero and one technique at A&M. So there's guys in the middle of the draft at defensive tackle that I think you need to at least take a flyer on. And that's why I think it's important to trade back from that 24th pick and pick up some extra capital to work with.
Kyle, can you define Jerry Jones standard time?
It's never on time. That's the best way to put it. It's Jerry Jones time. And most likely you're talking at least 15 to 30 minutes behind because he just loves to talk. He loves to talk about the Cowboys or whatever the topic of conversation is that day.
So what will it be like tonight? You have the draft that will start. You guys are going to be weaving it out, I guess, about 6 o'clock, the coverage because of the timing of the draft. How much is being said to you in the IFB or a producer, et cetera, compared to what you're doing, the others involved in the broadcast? How hectic can it be?
Oh, it's a lot of fun. It's one of my favorite days of the year. And I've always wanted to be, you guys know this from when I was interning with you guys. I've always wanted to be on the fly on the wall of draft content as a whole. And I get to be that to a certain extent in the building with the Cowboys draft coverage. And the way that they relay that information is usually they'll give us a couple of names early on, usually around 5:30, 6 o'clock, right when we're going on air. They give us kind of a short list of guys to keep an eye on as the draft goes along. And then as it adjusts, that list will ebb and flow. That list will go from 5 names down to 3 names, then it'll go back up to 6 names, and then they're going to redo and say maybe there's 8 names on the board. Last year it came down to 3. It was Monsey Smith, it was Matthew Bergeron, and then there was a third name. I can't remember the third name in there, but it was really the 2 between Smith and Bergeron that it came down to at pick 27 last year. So the fact that we get to hear that conversation and try and relay that without actually trying to relay it all the way through on the draft process has been such a fun part of my career, and it's been a blast to cover over the last few years. Can't wait to get after it again.
Appreciate your time today. Good luck tonight, Kyle Youmans. Great to see you at the Big 12 Pro Day up in Frisco when we were there. Great job by